this spiel several times already, but we want to thank you again for coming to the inaugural event. We have an exciting session with Peter Hope, John Kerrigan, and Ryan Moore. So please feel free to ask questions when they're ready. Make sure you've had your BPI number put in the Identify app, and on the way out, make sure you scan the QR code to make sure you get your CEUs. And if you have any questions, feel free to find us at the booth. Without further ado, let these guys get started.
How's it going, everyone? Good? Nothing's been thrown yet. So I see we have a lot of people here. So just want to kind of get a read on the room first. So who here works in the Empower Plus program? Everybody here? Is there anybody here that's not with the Empower Plus program? Okay, fair enough. All right, so today what we're going to be discussing here is basically the life cycle of an air source heat pump project through the Empower Plus program and the journey of that project from when you complete the initial audit through its completion and submission. Now, who here have had some struggles with that over the last 6 or 8 months? Good, so it sounds like we got the right crowd, we got the right room. So, let's get things started here. So that's what we're kind of talking about here. So it all starts with the assessment. So for today's purposes, we're going to basically go on the premise that the project has already gone through the application phase. It's been approved, right? And that customer has now been deemed eligible for an Empower Plus project, either Tier 1 or Tier 3. The incentive caps are something that are associated to that income tier, but ultimately it's still the same type of project, right? At the end of the day, it's really a difference in how those incentives are going to be broken out. But it's really the same project, Tier 1 or Tier 3, right? So for that 80% median income or that 60% median income. So we're going to take a look at the assessment, some of the data collection that's associated to that. From there, we're going to take a look at the submission preparation, right? So as the contractors gain that information, what he needs to do with that information in order to put that into our software, into the NIHA portal, and be able to submit that. And then from there, we're going to take a look at some contractor resources and references based on that submission preparation, if there's questions or anything like that, and some areas that contractors can go to obtain some additional support on some of the questions they may have. From there, once that project has actually been submitted, we're going to take a look at the work scope review and what that process kind of looks like. And then after that, we're going to look at the measures to installation and that final project submission. So once you've got the project approved, you went out in the field, you've completed that work, what's required with that project, and then from there, submitting that project and that process, right? So you can actually get paid for the work you guys have done. So once that project's been submitted and it's in our final project review, what does that review look like, right? So that verification process that we're doing on the program side, once you've submitted that project. And at the end, if you guys aren't sick and tired of listening to us talk up here, we're gonna have some time hopefully for some Q&A. So we have an hour to kind of go over a very dense topic, and everyone's very familiar with this process, right? So we're hoping to be able to shed some light on this to streamline the process for everyone that's in the room and the companies that you're working with, who you represent. Depending on that time frame, we'll try to field some calls as we're going through that. But at the end, if we do get short on time, we want to let you all know that this is the last session of the day before the session with the hub. So feel free to stick around, make ourselves available, and we'll answer those questions you might have if we can't get to them during the process, okay? We understand the importance of this. We know the frustrations that some of you have been experiencing over the last few months associated with these projects, but we're really here to help you today and help support that so we can maybe help eliminate some of those pinch points or some of those frustrations that you've actually been experiencing. So at the end of the day, you leave here empowered and feeling like you've taken something away from this so that you're set up for success, or where to go get some additional information so that down the road maybe there's two questions instead of 5, or maybe what some of that send back notes are, or what those revisions may be required, what that's kind of pointing to, so that you're familiar with the process as a whole, right? So at the end of the day, we all can have a little easier time navigating this process that we've been kind of working our way through in the last, say, 6 or 8 months or so. All right? Any questions? All right, so as we spoke to here first, right? So it's the assessment and the data collection associated to that. So I'm going to actually step around. I don't know if you Is it okay? Everyone hear me okay? It's a small enough room, right? So this way I can kind of see the slide here. So, what you want to do is when you're meeting with that customer, right? You want to kind of set yourself up for success at the beginning, right? So when you're first initiating that contact with that customer, you don't want to overpromise. You want to overdeliver, right? You want to start off with a clean slate. Make sure that when you're in there and you're discussing the entire project process with this customer, right? You're not overpromising, right? So with these heat pump projects, it's a little bit longer than your standard or typical Empower Plus project, and there are some nuances to that. So you want to make sure that you're not overpromising or committing to something you can't deliver on, because the rules and the guidelines are associated to these types of projects. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're very clear and transparent on the timeline of these projects, because sometimes there are protracted timeframes, especially if you're braiding dollars and bringing project dollars in, or program dollars in from another program other than Empower. Sometimes the coordination on those, it takes a little bit of time to line those up, right? So that timeline sometimes can be protracted out in itself, let alone the project in Empower. You want to introduce the program requirements that may influence some of the particulars of this project, right? We all know that decommissioning is part of these heat pump projects, so we want to make sure up front that the customer is understanding of that, and is also willing to let that take place as well too. In addition to that, we want to make sure that that home doesn't have natural gas, right? So there are some particulars associated to these projects that we need to be very clear and upfront with the customers to set those expectations up front. In addition to that, there are some documentation that's going to be required. So in addition to the standard documents that are required, there's also now the contract, right? So this is a good time to interject, or to the customer that newer requirement for our program, but it's something that we should be familiar with on a daily basis working with customers, right? So there is that contract requirement, and informing the customer that once you've obtained that approved work scope, this is going to be fed into that contract, and there's going to be a signed contract that's required right before any work commences. Let's see here. So discussing some of the incentive caps that are there, discussing if there's any available third-party funding that might be available, if there's been any coordination with other representatives in the community, such as the energy hubs, or maybe some of the RPCs or the MPCs, the rural preservation companies, right? Maybe there's weatherization that's been on board, something like that. I know there's a lot of coordination that goes on out there, but we want to explore that to see if there's any additional funds that are coming in, or if they've been working with another entity that you may not be aware of as well too, right? Because that's going to inform some of your project as well, so that when you're building that work scope, there may be some measures you may identify during that assessment at that time that you may not need to include, or you may be able to include as third-party funding or as leverage dollars that can be braided into our program, so that you can apply those incentives to another measure potentially, right, depending on what you identify. And then from there, you're going to actually, if the customer is expressed an interest in that heat pump or heat pump technology, you're going to want to kind of begin that discussions with the customer as well too, as far as the different systems that are out there. Ducted systems versus heads versus zoning, all that type of thing, right? So, maybe go in there informed so that you can start laying the groundwork depending on what you find in that home, so that you can start setting those expectations and presenting those ideas to the customer as you're developing this project, right? So at the same time, you may be able to kind of like plant a seed and actually put an action item on the customer at that particular time while you're developing that project, so they're not calling you 4 times a day, right? Because maybe there's something that they can do on their end to get some information to you while you're getting your information together to have that informed conversation of next steps. In addition to the equipment selection or the system design, there's also some of the benefits and the drawbacks to the heat pump technologies, right? So you want to be very transparent with the customers with that as well too. So it's the shiny new penny right now in our industry, but at the same time, it's not a good fit for all homes. And depending on what you find, you may want to start having those conversations as well too. And then at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're very clear about what that entire journey of this project might look like, right? So again, it's not over-promising, having a frank conversation about expectations on production schedules. Yep, sure. So again, it's really working with that customer while you're gaining that information, but at the same time, it's part of, it's the art of the sale, right? So it's actually setting that project up to make sure that you're gonna have success at the end and through the from start to finish on that project and the different various stages of that project might be. All right, so in addition, so this slide here, it's really kind of just to represent kind of like the different measures that potentially could be you know, identified at a home, but it's also prioritizing those measures as well too, right? So this is a tool that's on the contractor support site, but really it's based on the information you're obtaining during that assessment and prioritizing those measures. Understanding too that depending on the level of work or how much work needs to happen in that home and what those available incentives are and what other, there's some room in here if you guys want to come in. If you're more than welcome to come in if you guys want to. There's a couple chairs, but you good? All right. So with that, it's really just having an understanding of prioritizing those measures. So, high savings first, right? Making sure we're addressing the shell or that the insulation deficiencies we might see, and then looking at that as so from an energy efficiency, I'm thinking program versus like application here. But when you're looking at those measures and developing that work scope, right, you want to make sure for the customer, you're targeting those ones they're gonna see those realized savings, especially if there's customer contributions involved. But in addition to that, if you're looking at this as potentially like a 2 or a 3-stage project, you want to make sure that when you're doing that, each project itself is comprehensive. You're not leaving voids that's going to put that house into maybe a potential harmful situation until that next project can also take place. But in addition to that, you want to leave some savings on there as well too, because each project through the Empower Plus program needs to be a standalone project, right? It needs to support itself, so it needs to make sure we need to make sure that it meets those the project level cost effectiveness, criteria and the other nuances associated with that. So as we're kind of going through the projects themselves and we're looking at this house, we want to make sure that the project is going to be eligible, right? So there are some things here where it would deem the project not eligible for incentives for heat pumps right now. And some of those are that the house has a primary heating fuel for natural gas. So natural gas homes currently, if they have natural gas as the primary fuel, they don't qualify for incentives. We're not replacing an existing heat pump. As if they have an existing heat pump, maybe it's not cold climate, we can't replace them out to put a new heat pump in. Or if the existing equipment that's in the home is less than 5 years old, we can't do that either, right? Because that heating system still has some life in it, right? We don't want to be ripping out a heating system that potentially can operate for the next 10 years and not see the savings or get the ROI on that particular piece of equipment. So in addition to that, we will need to make sure that the new system we're proposing covers no more than 110% of the total heating load. We'll get into that a little bit because I know there's some questions regarding that, so we can drill down on that. There's minimum insulation levels as well as overall air changes per hour, or what that blower door number is, right? And you can see here in the table on the right-hand side, this is in section 510 of the contractor resource manual. But this table kind of gives you what those minimum R values are, or fill the capacity depending on what that criteria is, as well as what the air tightnesses are. And then in addition to that, we're also looking at the funding, right? The incentives caps that are there, that are in place, as well as the available funding and the overall system cost, right? And we can't leverage the clean heat incentives anymore into our program, so we need to make sure that they're not there. But there are other programs in various parts of the states where you can braid dollars, right? So, but if you're not familiar with any of those, I would encourage you to reach out to your energy hubs and to see if they may be if they're aware of some. There are some local community block grants that areas have that can help offset some of these costs as well too. Right, so I really encourage you, there are funds out there. There's a lot of money out there right now. It's just up to you guys to kind of find where those pools of money are that can potentially help offset some of these costs. All right, so now we're getting into kind of like the assessment itself and then the data collection requirements associated to our assessments. So when we're looking at the existing conditions, when you're out there in the field and looking at the different components of the building, right? We need to make sure we're getting accurate measurements and pictures and documentation associated to the walls, the attics, the basements, any garages maybe tuck under garage, right? So what's that building itself look like? What information do you need to provide us when you're submitting that project? Or what information do you actually need to gather, even better set, right? What information do you need to gather when you're in the office or in the field, so that when you're in the office, or if you're handing that project off to somebody that's maybe processing that project for you, what do they need so they can actually do their job to build that work scope, right? So we need to make sure that we're identifying that conditioned heat, the total heated area. We're looking at the heating and the water heater systems, right? We're getting that information. We're taking pictures of that. We're doing our CAS testing, all right? So if we're doing a heat pump, or maybe we're leaving an atmospheric water heater, we want to make sure if we're tightening that building up and we're getting that 7 ACH, we're not going to leave that orphaned and not venting appropriately, right? So these are all part of this is all part of the project, whether it's getting a heat pump or it's going to be having a heat pump proposed or not, right? And then we're doing a blower door determining what that air leakage rate is of that building. As far as photos go, right? So everybody knows it works in the Empower program now. When we're talking about photos, they're all geotagged right now. So that's something that's been newly introduced here in the last 6 months, and then especially now on submission now since the first of the year. But so any of the photos we're referencing here, it just goes without saying the requirements associated with those, okay? But as far as the photos go, we should be taking pictures of all sides of the dwelling. We want to capture pictures of the refrigerator and the freezer and their nameplates, right? Need to be the primary appliance as well too. Secondary fridges don't count, primary only. We're taking a look at the HVAC systems there. We're getting their nameplates. We're taking pictures of the ductwork, the plenums, right? So you guys are out there, it doesn't cost anything to develop these pictures anymore like it used to 30 years ago, right? So it's easy to hit that button on the bottom with your thumb, take those pictures. We're looking to take pictures of pre-existing installation levels. Could be in an attic, which is fairly easy as long as you can get into the attic. Sidewalls, I know has been a point of frustration recently, right? But there's ways to go about doing that as well too. But documenting and verifying what those installation levels are in those walls, so you can actually use that information when we're building our project. And any other targeted measures, we may be looking at trying to include a measurement, right? So any place there may be a deficiency that you want to propose, and then anything there may be an exception that you want to provide us a picture for, right? So these are all the minimum requirements for the photos. And then there's also the required documentation as well too, right? So there's the test-in form, there's the house diagram, there's the appliance exchange agreement, there's the utility bills, right? As well as if you can't get the utility bills, there's the waiver. So you can use that energy waiver form. Just if you go to use that, just make sure it's filled out in its entirety and that the customer's signed off on it, okay? So it is acceptable in some instances for delivered fuels only, but just make sure it's filled out as it's supposed to be. But on the utility bills, right, talking about setting those expectations we did on a couple slides ago, when your office is reaching out to set up those appointments, or if you're doing it yourself, right, that's a good time to let the customer know that that's one of the pieces of documentation that you're going to be looking at when you're there at the house. So set that up, right? Let them know when I'm there, I'm going to need to see a 12 months history of delivered fuels if they're available, as well as a copy of your delivered utility bills, right? The delivered fuels, the utility the utility bills. Thank you. So, but because we need copies of those, whether they're pictures, however you're recording that, right? But we need to see that. If you can't get good records, we still need to see a copy of one, and then also include that with so it shows we have verification that that's the primary fuel that's being included, right? So in addition to that waiver too, when you're filling out that waiver, just try to be as accurate as possible when you're trying to determine what that usage is as well. That's going to impact the overall savings on the project. We'll get into that a little bit a little bit further down the road as well. But it's important that it's an accurate reflection of what that building consumes. Okay. All right. So some of the data collection methods that we see being used by contractors, right? So you can see company cam is like a feature. It's one of the. You want to come in, Ryan, and talk to this a little bit, or?
Sure.
So the but so ultimately it's important that you have consistency as far as the data collection goes within your company. doesn't matter if you've got 1 or 2 people out in the field and doing the assessments, or if you've got a field of 20 guys doing those assessments, right? Consistency is key, because from that consistency, it allows you to develop internal processes, and from those internal processes, it actually allows you to have a system in place. When you have those consistent systems in place, it eliminates the areas for error to take place. Or if there is an issue, you can pinpoint it on one, and one correction can correct the entire process leading up to that, right? So consistency is key. One of the nice things about doing that is some data collection sheets like I've got on the page here, but also too this with Company Cam. I know a lot of people are using Company Cam now these days, and Ryan is going to speak to that for a second, but that also is another way to actually set yourself up for success.
Yeah, we were a pretty early adopter of Company Cam, so I think we're going on our 3rd year, and didn't really want to use it at first because we thought we had a good way to collect photos of the field, put them into company folders. But we ended up trying it, a couple people liked it, and now we can like create work scopes, we can create checklists, anything you got newer employees, you're trying to have complex work scopes, you can put it on there and you can have photos required as you're going through it. It's a really easy way to kind of make a work scope for people to see in the field. We don't have any of those examples up, I don't think.
Well, there's one picture on the bottom we're actually, this was a picture actually from one of Collis's projects where you were designing a heat pump. Yeah. And you can see the picture on the bottom here. They actually wrote where they were looking to place a head on that wall. So I did cut it so it would fit onto the screen, but that's an example of some of the options that are available through Company Cam.
We've actually moved all of our work scope generation. We just had a meeting last week. All of our work scopes are getting created in Company Cam. A lot of the guys can create the work scopes while they're at the house doing the audit when they're saying specific like register locations or unit placement or things of that nature. And it's really easy to put it together, and it's really easy to export.
Yep. So, and kind of speaking to that too, right? So like the bottom bullet here where it talks about internal checklists. So depending on what you're doing out in the field, right? If you have those internal checklists, that allows you to make sure that you're capturing all the data the first time when you're in the field, right? Nobody wants to go back to get something that they could have got the first time. It just throws a wrench into the scheduling. It also puts a wrench in the processing when you're in the office as well too, because you can't move that project forward because you're missing something, right? So something as simple as like an internal checklist or something like that, allows you to make sure you're getting the data when you're needed the first time, and eliminates some of those frustrations that may be a result of not getting that. All right, so work scope submission. So we kind of went through the audit and the assessment. It's pretty straightforward for everyone, right? Any questions on that? No? Okay.
Just a quick thing, and just to reiterate what John said, like we spend a little bit of extra time there at the beginning because we want to make sure that everyone also takes a little bit of extra time at the beginning to collect all that data, because just like you said, you don't want to have to go back. We hear it numerous times where it's like, now I have to go back and get either a signature or more photos. So kind of like preparing helps out a lot.
What additional documents are required with the heat pump project?
So we're actually going to get into that. So
okay.
Yeah, so the next part of the presentation is the bulk of the presentation, right? So this is the submission. We're gonna try to clearly outline this for you guys, right? If there are questions, depending on our time, we can always visit afterwards, right? But we do gotta go through the different documents that are required as far as, and as well as the verification points that we're looking at as well too. All right, so first and foremost, right, so you've got the information, you're getting ready to submit this project. Kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, right, but there's that verification that this project is eligible, right? There's no sense in going through all of the tasks of creating the documents, generating all this other paperwork, right, if the project isn't eligible, right? In the beginning, back in July and August, we saw a couple of projects come through with natural gas as primary fuels. They're not eligible for incentives, so it's unfortunate, but all that time and the energy and the effort that was put in the front end was for naught, right? So it's really frustrating. And it's not just frustrating for you, it's frustrating for the customer and everyone that's involved, right? So we completely understand that. So it's really making sure that the people that are preparing the work scopes have a good understanding of what this is, to make sure that project can move forward through the program, right? So again, it's the primary fuel, no natural gas. older than 5 years. So if it's a newer, oil or LP type of combustion appliance, right, they're not going to be eligible. The system needs to meet that 100 to 110%. Need to verify and make sure that those shell requirements are there in place, or they're included as part of that work scope, right? All the components for that project are actually included in the cost of the heat pump measure. There's no clean heat incentives being braided into that dollar, right? So we want to make sure that that's there. And as far as like the work scope submission aspect of it, we want to make sure that the existing conditions are fully included there, right? And they're accurate and they kind of align with that manual J and the manual S as close as they can, right? We'll touch on that a little bit down further, but we want to make sure that, you know, it's fairly accurately represented in the existing conditions, and we're looking at those photos and we're looking at the drawings and all the supportive docs that you guys have provided to make sure that everything's kind of in alignment, right?
Can you define all components in the price?
Yep, we'll get into that. Yep. Yes.
What's the thinking in excluding natural gas, or why is natural gas specifically
So
in the program?
it's currently right now it's part of the funds. It's not there. So really it's the savings that are kind of pushing that. The cost of the BTU for natural gas is much lower compared to like oil or LP, right? So it's really hard to obtain those savings, and for that reason, yep. And due to the cost of the systems that are going in as well too, right? So, and then after that, and last but not least, once we built that project, right, and we've kind of put it together, we want to make sure that project's actually showing at least 20% of the energy cost savings, and then we'll kind of get into that too. With the caveat, there may be some extenuating circumstances as to why you're not seeing those savings, right? If you come across those, more often than not they do, but if there is something there that is maybe limiting what those savings are being realized in that project, you can submit that, but make sure it's documented and you have a good note to support that, right? We want to look at those. If we want to make the recommendation on that, we can. We want to make sure we have the information to support that, okay? All right, so preparing that work scope, it should reflect the information that you've obtained during the assessment, right? So you've gone through and you've evaluated the shell and the mechanicals in the home. We've identified those deficiencies and where those areas for improvement may be. That work scope should also include the customer's interests or existing concerns in the home. So my heating system's on its way out, and it's no longer, it's been nickel and diming me, right? I've got receipts here that show I've had somebody in here 3 times a year for the last 2 years keeping this thing together, right? So that's a customer interest there. And then we want to make sure that the minimum requirements are met programmatically, right? So they can actually get those proposed incentives, right? So if you're submitting that project, we want to make sure that this project can receive those incentives. We're prioritizing those measures based on the savings that can be obtained, right? So we want to make sure that that shell is being brought up to level. And kind of like an example of this would be attic and wall insulation versus a window replacement. We all know cost per square foot to insulate a 6-inch wall versus replacing one window is about a 10-to-1 ratio at minimum, right? And the R value when you're looking at a dense pack 2x4 wall versus the R value on a piece of glass, that wall is going to win all day long. And so for a tenth of the cost, we're seeing a lot more savings on that wall. Yes.
Is there any way of possibly making it a requirement for the customers to fill out their interests and existing concerns in the initial application? Just reducing, the time spent going from customer to customer to figure out what their needs are?
Sometimes that information is included on the application. Sometimes it is,
Yeah.
right? But
for the majority, it's not.
It is, and it depends on where those applications are kind of like coming from and who's helping them process, right? So there's that's a whole nother, I think that's a whole nother hour session, right?
Yeah.
But I totally agree with you. But I think you can, once that referral comes to you, so if it's a program provided referral, right? You could use that as part of your setting that expectation in the front. Add that question to your questionnaire. Do you have any concerns, or are there certain things you're looking for, right? Because a lot of the times we'll hear where we need a new roof and we need windows, right? Unfortunately, that's not our program, but that's where building those relationships with the hubs comes in handy, where if there's a home grant or an access grant that maybe can help facilitate that, so that maybe it might not be right now, but maybe 6 months down the road, right? So it's all part of those conversations with customers and those community hubs.
Yeah, we just find that the initial intake is taking anywhere between 15 to 30 minutes just on the phone before we
Yep.
step foot in the house, so.
Yeah,
if
and that's not,
there's
and to be honest with you, we hear that a lot. That's pretty much like, I think that's pretty much the standard, depending on the time that's spent, but really trying to vet those customers, understanding what that is, right, for sure.
But even if there was any like check boxes or anything, like, we're interested in HVAC, we're interested in insulation, we're interested in,
Mhm.
that would just be.
We can definitely bring that back and make that recommendation for you,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and I guess I would also add, like, with the, kind of the rollout of My Energy,
Yeah.
later on, that should also help,
Right.
because that's gonna provide the
Yeah.
homeowner with more information.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, and then based on that work scope is the consideration of the available incentives, the incentive caps, overall customer contributions, right? So depending on the customers, sometimes they do have some available funds to them, right? That may sometimes influence whether or not a heat pump can actually go forward or not, depending on what those incentives are. But at the end of the day, there's no sense of proposing a project where there's gonna be a $12,000 or $15,000 customer contribution if the customer, you gotta be realistic with the project as well too, right? So it's, as you're developing this work scope, it's taking a look at that and understanding the information you have to work with. So on top of that, you've got your NIHAP inputs, right? So the inputs themselves are used to calculate the energy savings based on the TRM, and it also determines the available incentives for those proposed measures. So depending on the incentive caps, right? So you have your 10,000, your 5,000 initial Empower incentive, and then you have your IRA incentives. Once those incentive caps have actually been maxed out, that's when those IRA funds start, if the customer is eligible for IRA, that's when those funds start coming in. So it's important that when you're building your work scopes, you're putting those measures in there to identify where those incentives are coming from and what's available, right? Then there's the required program documentation. And there's with those documentations, there's signatures required at those various steps, whether it be on the test in or during the initial assessment or on test out, right? The contract itself, right, that should be signed before work is actually, it's not gonna be obtained at the time of the audit, but that contract should be signed before any work is being done. Although it's required at the end, really it's to protect you, right, the contractor, to make sure that there's an agreement in place before that work proceeds. And then there's the project eligibility confirmation. There's the incentives, there's the PLC, or project level cost effectiveness, and then there's also the energy savings requirements. So as you're building these projects and you're starting to build these, right, these are all the different things you should be mindful as you're kind of putting these things in here. Because if you've got a lot of health and safety and you don't have a lot of energy savings, right, that might tank that project. It may not stand on its own because you don't have that PLC, you don't have those savings. All right, so existing conditions, you can see on here, we've got a screenshot and some areas of interest. I think there's a pointer here. Maybe not. What's this? Ah, there we go. I don't have to put my glasses down twice for that one. All right, so some points that we want to look at here, right? So there's the total conditioned square footage. There's the air sealing, or there's a blower door number here, right, it's from test in. There's the installation levels that we're looking at. So we've got the attics themselves, and then basically now we've recently had some enhancements added to NIHAP. So when you're adding the total depth of the installation that's existing, it's giving you an R value here at the bottom. That was missing for a long time, and I know that was a very frustrating point when you guys were developing work scopes. When you'd say there was 4 inches of fiberglass, we had no idea what that R value was being assigned in there, because if you weren't proposing it, and before you know it, it wasn't in alignment with your manual J, because the way the TRM calculates versus what the manual J is, right? Those 2 different calculations, 2 different software, they don't necessarily align. So that was a point of frustration. So now there's been a couple fields that have been added here, but it's ensuring that those existing conditions, as they are identified at the home at the time of the assessment, are captured in here. Right. In addition to that, we've also got the sidewalls, right? So there's some additional shell here. You can see here, there's the exterior walls. If it's a 2x4 wall, if there's no insulation in there? If there's no insulation there in an empty void, it's assigning an R4 there. All right, it's for that empty void. As soon as you start proposing insulation there, it actually calculates that R value based on the insulation that you're adding and the type of insulation. And then we're also looking at the windows here. Now, the reason why we want to see this information, because this kind of informs when we're doing our verification against the Manual J, right? Because the Manual J is built off the existing conditions and any improvements that may be proposed. You have to model them in the existing conditions in order to propose them for the measure, right? If they're not in the existing conditions, there's no way to actually propose them for additional incentives. Yes, sir?
Can I have software taking out the R value for the sheeting and the drywall?
No. So we'll get into that. So what we're looking at when we do that, we'll get into the verification on that, Mike. But when we're looking at the insulation, right? If you're saying there's 4 inches, you're adding 4 inches of fiberglass or 4 inches of cellulose, depending on what you're doing, right? And that total R value, we want to see that kind of like that same type of representation in your Manual J. The Manual J is looking at that surface as a whole and is taking all the components of that surface, determining the overall U value of that surface based on those different R values, right? You've got your wood studs, you've got your sheathings, right? I'm preaching to the choir here, but NIAP is looking at insulation levels, so we know that they're not talking apples to apples, right? But the insulation should be very close so that the existing conditions closely align to what that Manual J looks like, right? Yes, sir.
So when we're building the Manual J, we're using the existing conditions for insulation or proposed?
Well, so it needs to be within if it's not meeting that minimum requirement for our program, you should be proposing that for an upgrade, if you can, right? So there's a couple slides down the road, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but unless it's filled to capacity, where you can't upgrade that, right?
So say it's a job where we're proposing insulation.
Yep.
When we build the Manual J, we're submitting it based on the proposed insulation level.
Correct.
Not existing.
Exactly, but you have to have it in existing conditions in order to propose the upgrade.
Right.
That's the only way, right, so that's why it needs to be there, right? So. Right, so like in this particular example here, you can see like based on the existing conditions, find the laser button again, there's deficiencies within the 4 highlighted boxes here. So we've got the attic, we've got the sidewalls, we've got the rim joist, as well as the air sealing. So because those deficiencies don't meet those minimum requirements for our program, we want to make sure that in addition to those existing conditions, you're actually looking to submit those to bring them up to our minimum requirements, okay? So you can see the air sealing has been proposed, the attic insulation's been proposed to upgrade, right? The exterior walls, and then the rim joist, and then the incentives associated to that. So when you're building that project, right, looking at the incentives as a whole, if you're building that project, depending on the square footages and what that additional work may need, it may impact the overall available incentives for that heat pump, right? It may not, because that may have been a project that was previously completed as well too. So maybe most of those surfaces have been upgraded, and you are to that heat pump ready type of minimum standard that we're looking for. But just be mindful that this can potentially impact what that project's going to look like and the available incentives for you. Right, and then you've also got the air sealing here as well too. So you can see here, you've got your pre-number comes in from when you did the original blower door. When you're proposing the air sealing, you can actually include what you propose your test out number to be. And then based on that, you can include a description down here as well too of what that air sealing is going to look like, right? So when you're looking at your air sealing, you need to be realistic about what your expected final blower door number is too, right? And the reason being is like if you're at 18, 20, 22, ACH, and you say you're going to get it to 6.9 for $500, like how's that going to happen, right? There needs to be some pretty good documentation on that. That's pretty good. But it's really it's bigger than just trying to get the project through, right? But you're designing this equipment to operate within a certain standard. And if you're not obtaining that number, but your Manual J has been, and your Manual S has been sized off that Manual J, and you've designed that system to operate at a certain level, right, based on certain criteria, and that criteria is not met, this system is grossly going to underperform compared to what it's supposed to. And what does that lead to? It leads to callbacks for you guys, and it's irritated customers, right? So nobody wants to see that. So it's just making sure that it's accurately reflected, right, when we're putting these together. And then in addition to the air sealing, we've got the exterior walls too. And you can kind of see here a breakout over here on the side. 4 inches in NIHAP in this particular example, right, is saying that the final R value is going to be roughly 17.6. 4 inches of fiberglass or cellulose, and we see that anywhere from an R11 to an R13. And looking at what that final U value is, understanding there's going to be that difference. But really what we're looking at is we want to see that roughly within an R5, right? Nothing over an R5 difference between what's in NIHAP and what your manual J is. And that insulation level, not the U value, but that insulation that's being reflected. Because anything over that R5, really what that kind of points to is a different depth in that wall insulation that's actually being modeled versus what the actual reality is, okay? So there is that discretion when you're modeling in there, when you're actually proposing that. Understanding that there isn't going to be a perfect alignment between the two, but it should be fairly close. So you can use that 5 or less than 5 as that rule of thumb. Yeah, Mike.
Did I understand correctly? You want us to submit a manual J at current conditions? And
No.
A manual. Okay, just one manual.
Just the one manual J. That's what you're using to determine the total load on that building, and that's what you're designing your system to.
So at proposed conditions, not current conditions.
Correct, because you're going to have I just want to clear, does everyone understand that, right? You're going to take your existing conditions, identify those deficiencies, right? You want to include any upgrades, proposed upgrades on those deficiencies to make sure that you're meeting those minimum heat pump requirements. And then based on that, that's what you're basing your manual J on, right? Because now that we know that that house is going to meet those minimum requirements, and that's the load that you're looking to identify with that manual J. And then that system design is actually going to support that load. All right, so this here really is kind of like a breakdown of, on the left-hand column here. So this is the different tabs that you see on the right side of your work scope submission tab, right? And if you take a look at that, you've got your applicant information tab. You've got your utility and fuel information, you've got your existing conditions, you've got your partner information, and then based on these different tabs and what they are, it's the different areas of, so you've got the description of what they are, but then also the inputs associated to that verification document that may be used in support of that, and then some of the verification points or points of interest that we should be focused on when you're actually looking at this, right? So there's another couple slides that kind of like drill back down on this, but ultimately, if you're looking at the utility and fuel and information here, we want to make sure that the usages match, right? We want to make sure the account numbers are accurate, and the primary heating fuel comparison is there, right? Everything needs to align. If you're saying that the primary heat is wood, and we have propane bills, like, okay, so what is the primary, right? So we want to make sure everything's very clearly lined out, and that it's consistent through the entire project, right? The existing conditions, we kind of just spent some time on that. We've got your notes, include notes, right? So notes field is probably one of the least used part of NIHAP. Information's always good, right? Some of the enhancements that we added to NIHAP recently, the air sealing, I know somebody asked me, why are we asking for more information on the air sealing? It's to provide some of that description that you're looking to include that's actually going to make sure that that building gets to that 7 ACH, right? Or you're going to meet that minimum. Back in the day with MCALC, when we were actually doing air sealing, if we didn't hit our targeted number way back when there was another implementer even, you wouldn't get paid unless you hit that SIR of 1.0, remember? So that's no longer the case. But what we want to see is we want to see we want to see something in there. Blower door assisted air sealing is great, but if you're looking to reduce 4,000 CFM, blower door assisted air sealing is going to be used with something else, right? So you just want to include in notes in there what you're planning for that project. Is there a picture? Reference a picture. Like if you've got a picture where you've got a huge tiger trap up in that attic, include that, right? Because those are huge savings. Cantilevers, yes.
Hey, John.
So I'll let you go first and I'll get you second. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there any talk about, dropping 12 air changes per hour down to 7? Or, I'm sorry, 7 to, raising it from 7 to 12 from houses like they do for mobile homes?
I haven't heard
The reason I'm
anything.
asking is a lot of times, houses with, older farmhouses with oil furnaces and
Yep.
whatnot. I mean, to really hit that 7 air changes per hour, you need to replace the windows.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually really old windows, they're not broken. So, I've seen that as for me, that's been an obstacle.
Yep.
to Meeting, guidelines to get the homes up to
Yep.
pump ready.
Yep.
Is there any talk going on around that? I meant to ask this earlier, so I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. So no is the short answer, but but
I guess I would say program is definitely aware
Yeah.
that everybody wants a change.
Yeah.
So it's definitely on their mind, thinking through it, trying to determine what is going to be the best number.
right.
But that's what we have for now.
Yeah.
So that's what we all.
So it is a topic on the list, but the short answer right now is no. But there is discussions. So okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah, so those like secondary image requests or secondary images, do those have to be geotagged as well?
yes, all pictures submitted need to be geotagged.
Have to be in PDF form, or like if we're asked for an extra picture, so do we have to remake the picture report and combine them all, or can we upload?
In certain circumstances, if it was sent back and requesting a separate picture, I could see an exception being granted, but it'd be a one-time. The expectation is that it's included with the one submission. All right. So, but understanding that sometimes there are variables that are out of our control,
Yeah.
right? But all right. So, kind of getting into some of the other than the existing conditions, like kind of calling out the usage in the fuel information tab here, calculating those usages, making sure that they're accurately reflected here, right? Making sure we're getting that primary heating fuel in there. If you have that energy waiver form and you're calculating that out, like it's not a bad idea to kind of show how you came up with the numbers that you did. If you've got partial bills, right? How did you come up with that determination? I've seen them come in with a 2,400 square foot house with 6,000 gallons of oil being estimated, right? That's not accurate, So, not saying that it was intentional, right? But we need to make sure that the information that's being used is a fairly accurate representation for that home. Because if the fuel savings aren't accurate here, it's going to impact the savings on your project, and it may tank the project, right? Or it may significantly overinflate those savings, right? Which, if it's over, there's no way a building should be producing 130% in savings, because we're not producing energy with this equipment that we're, or the improvements that we're actually putting into that house, right? So if you see those anomalies, if you see a really, really low savings, I had a project, so on that 6,000 gallon oil house, I had 7% savings, right? It was oil to air source heat pump. It should have driven all kinds of savings, right? So there was a tell there, right? So making sure that the utility information is accurate is really important. So kind of looking at how to obtain that or interpret some of that information, right? So you can see on the left here, this is a delivered fuel. It's actually oil, it was a oil receipt for a year's worth of usage. Call us actually Ted, was able to obtain these from the fuel provider, and I've worked with Ted in other facets, and different hats in different organizations. Ted's done a good job over the years developing relationships with the vendors and stuff like that, being able to obtain those records too. Sometimes it's hard depending on where you're at and the locales that you work in, right? But trying to get this information up front, setting that expectation for that customer on the front end will make your job easier down the road. And then also looking at the utility usage from the electric side too, right? An example here, it's not necessarily as easily identified with PSEG in this example versus say like NICEG on the last one. But here you can see a simple calculation that was done within this here. You can take the kilowatts per day, multiply it by how many days by the year. And this is a simple calculator you can actually keep on your desk too, right? So you could just put those numbers in And then from there, it kind of gives you what that usage is, and you can actually put that into NIHAP. Right, so talking about the program documentation, so if you're looking at Empower Plus projects across the board, these documents are required, right? An air source heat pump project requires these documents in addition to these other ones, right? So these documents are all included in section 510, which we'll show you in a little bit, but it does talk about the house drawings, right? So the house drawing for your standard project versus the house drawing for a heat pump may require a little more information, because these documents here are really the supportive documentation that you've used to actually build and develop this heat pump system and what you're proposing to the program, right? So we want to see as much as possible as far as like the measurements for the windows, the walls, right? Whether it be room to room, or if you're actually doing you know, a block, or if you're doing like you know, the entire building, right? So it doesn't have to be a CAD drawing. It can be a hand drawing, right? But just make sure you've got some details on there. It doesn't, you know, orientation, height of walls, roof pitch, you know, is something as well too, right? Especially if you're looking to insulate slopes versus that helps provide that square footages, right? So anything in there is going to actually point to the information that's included on the Manual J, but then also with the measures you're proposing in the work scope or in the existing conditions. So in addition to that, we're looking at the Manual J or other sizing software, right? Making sure that that Manual J is provided and is accurately reflected for what that house is. We've got the Manual S, which is really the equipment, right? The system design, the equipment that's been selected that actually meets the load identified in the Manual J. We've got the need certificates, which is you know, to support the equipment that's actually been selected. There's the photos themselves, right? So we do ask that the existing heating system be provided, right? Which helps support what that primary fuel is. And then if it's a ducted system and you're going to be looking to you know, incorporate that duct into your system, we want to see photos of that main plenum minimally, but some of that existing distribution as well too. And then obviously we just spend some time on the utility bills. And then based on the configuration type of the new system that you're actually looking to install, if you're looking at putting a ducted system in and there isn't, maybe it's a boiler, it's a hydronic system that was there and you're putting in a new duct system, or maybe it's a hybrid system and you're putting an air handler in an attic with some distribution on the second floor, right? So a Manual D would be required in those instances. If you're looking, or if you're going to be you know, modifying the existing distribution by more than 50%, right? So if there's significant modifications as well too, we're looking for a Manual D. And then for existing ducted systems where you're just basically tying into the existing distribution, you know, something like that potentially we've seen that in mobile homes, right? You know, at that point, what we're looking at is a picture of that plenum at that time, and then on the test out, there's some additional information that may be required at the end, right? So depending on that configuration type may inform some of those additional documents. In addition to that too, like mini splits too, it's a floor plan indicating where those head placements might be as per manufacturer specifications. It's not required until final, but if you wanted to include something as far as why you're proposing the heads locate, you know, based on the system design that we have, this is why we're putting in 18,000 in this particular place. You can also include that on there if you'd like as well too. It's not required at submission, but again, more information provided on the front end help paint that picture for us to, you know, to try to make those when we're doing those reviews. So here's an example of a house drawing, right? So it's fairly simple. It's not hand drawn, obviously, right? But with these drawings, we want to see the wall heights. The minimally, we want to see those exterior perimeters. The roof type was there. If there's any tuck under, any anomalies, right? If there's any outliers, and it's not your typical box, right? So, you know, tuck under garages, for instance, right? We're gonna be looking for potentially like a ceiling in there that's going to establish where that thermal boundary might be, right? So when we're looking at this and identifying what that condition square footage is, you know, that's the type of information we're looking for on here that helps support what those numbers are in that Manual J. And then again, like any of those outliers, right? 3-season porches, window types, you know, legend or something like that if you wanted, or, you know, all or double pane, whatever you wanted, like something along those lines that kind of keys us in. And again, the other thing you can do too is, like we just talked about company cam, right? If you've got pictures that you've taken, you want to reference a picture and include that in a note, right? You know, please see picture 5 in our picture presentation. It calls to where you're pointing to kind of paint that picture, right? It's that information where it lies. Yes, sir. 5 minutes left? Wow, okay. All right. My wife's always said I was hot-winded, but, you know, I guess long-winded. Full of hot air, long-winded, I guess. But you can all tell her I said she was right. But, so anyways, so now we're looking at the manual J itself, right? So we want to make sure that those NIAP inputs are kind of in alignment with what you have in your manual J, right? The documents are to support that system, right? We want to see that information transposed into NIHAP accurately so that, you know, savings are calculated appropriately, which are going to inform those incentive assignments, right? So it's important that the information from one is accurately moved into the other. Here you can see the heated square footage, and we're looking at the BTU, right? The BTU is the total load on the building. Additionally, we're kind of looking at some of the glazing, right? The windows. We're looking at the window type, and we're also looking at the ceilings or the attics as well too, right? They should be fairly closely, you know, accurately reflected in those existing conditions, understanding they're not going to align perfect. As far as the NEAP sizing or the manual S, right? So we look at the sizing tools. This here is an example of that advanced NEAP sheet. So from there, you can see some of the information that's recorded here on the NEAP sheet that actually needs to go on the NIHAP as well too, as far as the model numbers go, the total system load, right? And we're verifying that load requirement is met between 100 and 110%. Now, in some instances, if you look at section 510, right, your air source heat pump with the equipment you've selected may be a little bit under that 100%. You're allowed to include supplemental heat, all right? You're allowed up to 5 kW, no more than 20% of total load, right? You can do that. There's a couple different ways to articulate that. You can include that in your NIHAP inputs. Depending on the manual S that you're doing, like Elite for instance, you can actually model that supplemental heat in there, right? And it shows the load of that. So there's a couple different ways to go about doing that, but understanding that that system as a whole needs to be within 100 and 110%. And here in NIHAP itself, you can actually see where some of that data is actually recorded from that document, right? So you can see here you've got the configuration type. You can see what that load is, right? I'm going to be a little bit closer. Yep, you can see what the load is. Down here, down below, number 3 is basically your manual J and your manual S inputs. The manual S is actually, they're doing the math here, giving what that load is here. That should be fairly close to what your manual J is saying, right? It's, again, it's 2 different calculations, but it's a simple arithmetic, we hope. If you are doing supplemental heat, you can include that up here, right? So we know we can add that. You can include that with your manual J or your manual S down here, but the supplemental heat should be included up here if you are adding that. And then we've got the cost associated to it, and any new braided dollars that may be involved with that project. Once you've put that all through, and you're actually kind of looking at this, the funding information page, you can kind of see, once you've built that project, you're looking to see that this project actually is feasible, right? So, oh, there we go. Here you can actually see if there's any braided funds, utility, WAP, or third party, what that customer contribution may look like, that first year savings, right? So this needs to be over that 20%. If that PLC requirement's been met, and it says yes here, you can kind of take a look at your incentives down below here. You can see that you're just over that $10,000 incentive by 192 bucks, and you're at that maximum here incentive of 14,000, right? So it does check all the boxes on here, but these are kind of the verification points we want to take a look at, make sure. Is that, we're time?
Yeah, we're pretty much at time.
Okay.
But I guess one thing that I do want to say, obviously we're not going to be able to get through the entire life cycle here, but most of the items that John went over, like those are the things that we're actually checking as well. So that's why we want to make sure that you're actually providing them and to the detail that we need. so that we don't have to send it back. Like, we don't wanna send projects back to you either, so the better that we can make, yes. The better that we can make it clear to you what we need, then you're able to provide it to us.
Is there any thought to making those required before you can submit projects? Like, I think utility bill and maybe house graph are two that you have to actually put in before you can even submit something, or you get a warning.
So-
is there any way to do that where you're proposing a heat pump and then it's gonna say, okay, I need X, Y, and Z, so you're not trying to submit the project and jump back and forth with the rules and that, you know?
The problem with that is that the detail in those, right? So we've seen drawings come through, but they don't provide the information that we need. So although it could be a required document, it doesn't necessarily mean that the document that's actually being put in that place meets the minimum criteria, right? So I don't disagree with you that it'd be a good checks and balances, but I don't think that checks and balances would actually help eliminate some of the issues that we've seen. So with, I know we're at time and I apologize for going long here, but if people want to stay, I'm more than willing to keep going if people want to stay and go through that until they kick us out. But if you want to stay, I'm more than willing to keep going on this. If you want to leave, I take no offense to it because you guys have already listened to me for an hour.
And just one other thing, just based on obviously the interest in this, we're also gonna go through and record this.
Yeah.
And then post it on the contractor support site as well.
Yeah,
So
so-
and we'll put it in some smaller chunks, so it's easier to kind of digest.
So we'll give it like 20 seconds for people who want to leave, and then we can keep going if you guys want.
How much more of this is there left?
There's probably about 15 minutes. I could probably get through with it. There's some slides I can go through real quick.
I can talk about it after there's a specific job, and I had a question.
Okay.
So I'll hang out.
Okay.
But also, can you share this with us so we can send it out to the BPCA membership? Should be all right.
Yeah, I don't see why not.
The picture slides?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we definitely do that. Yep.
That'd be great.
Right. So, as far as photo documentation uploads, right? So Ryan spoke a little bit about using like the checklist and the templates within Company Cam. I know there's a presentation next door talking about Company Cam. Provides a geolocation, it provides some usability too for the contractors as well, right? But really just want to kind of touch, in addition to that formatting, right? We just want to make sure that we're aware of the minimum requirements as far as like the exterior sides of the homes, the appliance nameplates as far as the fridge and the freezer, as well as the HVAC equipment, right? So that's important. Make sure they're clear so we can see them and read the model numbers or serial numbers if we need to pull them down, as clear as possible. Those existing installation levels, whether it be attic or walls, any of those other targeted measures, as well as any exceptions you may be looking for, right? So this slide here, kind of want to spend a couple minutes on this one, because what this is all the required documents associated to our heat pump projects, right? So if we take a look at that, the middle column is really what that description of what that document is. So, for example, I'm not going to read all these to you, but like the Manual J, really, what's the intent of that Manual J? Where are we looking for that? But then there's the data comparison, right? So when we're looking at this, what are we looking at to verify versus the document we have in hand versus our inputs in NIHAP? Like, what are those data points we're looking at, right? Because if they don't line up, this may constitute a send back or a revision request, right? So when we're looking at that, we're looking at the total square foot of condition space between on the existing conditions and NIHAP, also what's in your Manual J. You know, if they're off a couple feet, you know, interior to exterior wall depth, whatever it is, that's really not a huge thing. But if we see like anything over say 5-10% of difference, depending on the size of that home, you know, there's a discrepancy there of some sort, right? So, you know, if we're missing 200-300 square feet, and I've seen it where, so like an example of that would be like with CoolCalc, there was actually a garage within the same footprint of the building. CoolCalc actually considered that conditioned space, and it was outside of the conditioned space, right? So it's those types of anomalies that we see that we sometimes catch because of that discrepancy. So when
Or you're tracing it, you're tracing
Yeah.
it in cool cal.
Right.
It's automatically calculating it. for
Right.
you.
Unless it's included in the trace, how is it
well,
captured?
it was included in the trace when he developed
Well,
it.
then that's a user.
It is, but that also is a revision. So a checks and balances for that, right, is when you're looking at your cool calc, when you develop that the conditioned square foot should be fairly close to what you've actually included in when you took your diagram based on the perimeter measurements that you've taken, right, of that conditioned space. So it's an internal QC point that you can actually look at to see if you've got an error maybe somewhere, right? Total BTU load. On that air source heat pump measure where you're proposing what that BTU load requirement is, we want to see that in alignment with that manual J. And then the insulation levels, we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, but we want to make sure that the insulation levels, whether it be in the existing conditions or if it's included with that proposed measure in that work scope, is closely aligned to what that manual J is, right? So that that BTU load that's associated to the manual J that was developed actually it supports what that building is going to be, right? That system design, 100 to 110%. So when we're looking at that manual S should articulate that total BTUs that can be provided by that system, right? And then we're also looking at the model numbers and from the NEEP sheets and making sure that they're actually input into NIHAP as well too. Make sure that they align. Because that's a verification on the back end too, right? It's important it's included on the front end to the submission. Because on the back end, when you hit that final project submission, we want to make sure that the equipment that was proposed is actually what was installed too. If there was a difference in the head or something like that, or the numbers don't align, the systems change at that point, right? So it's kind of there's a tell there. So and the house drawings, right? So everything, if you go down through this list here, it's really just kind of that data comparison versus the document versus your inputs in NIHAP, just to make sure that everything is kind of in alignment with one another before you hit that process button.
So would you say it's better to put all your information and your upgrades into NIHAP and then base your manual J off that, so you can match your match?
Well, your
manual J is best to the proposed. If you're doing proposed, if everything's already up to heat pump standard, then yeah, do your manual J. But if you got to dense pack the walls, you want to find out what that R value is in NIHAP and match it to your manual
as close
J.
as you can, but at the same, like your manual, you should know like what that if you're dense packing that wall with 4 inches of cellulose, right? So you're going to be at that 3.5 R value, whatever. So you can put that into that measure, into that surface.
Yeah.
And based on the siding and the interior, whatever those components of that structure is, right? That surface, it's going to give you what that U value is. As long as that R value is close to what NIHAP is, it's good, right? It's within that up to 5, right? We know it's not going to be perfect, but we don't want to see like that difference of like 10 or 12, because we've seen models, our walls modeled with 1 inch of insulation, so NIHAP showing like an R5, right? And then I'm seeing an R19 come through in the manual J. Well, this is a 2x6, this is 1 inch and a 5. Why aren't they dense packing it? That's a missed opportunity. It doesn't meet the minimum shell, right? So that kind of thing. So. Right, so just to kind of go through some of these slides. So there are some resources for contractors out there. I'm sure people are aware of these, but I just wanted to go over these real quick. So on contractor support, there's the program resources drop down in here. There's the program manual. There's the forms, which you can find. All the forms are required for our projects, as well as heat pump resources as well. There's heat pump training series in there. So there's a manual J, manual S. There's a bunch of different webinars that have been provided over the last 6 months by various entities. The recordings are in there. So if you've got staff that are coming on board, or if you've got questions on things, you can definitely check it out there. There's our monthly webinars that we hold, right? So if there's questions related to like incentive amounts or changes in funding or whatever the case is, normally you can find something in here in the webinars. And then there's also links to previously recorded webinars as well too. Is there a question? No. Okay. Section 510. This is the meat and the potatoes of heat pump requirements, right? I think everybody's seen that note once or twice. But really, everything that we're going over today, right, is in this section and 8.2 where photos are, right? But it's, all this information's here, it's just really kind of understanding how to parse it. But if you've got questions on things, definitely go in here and take a look. If there are revisions to this, you'll see that it'll actually be highlighted in red with the most recent revision date in there, right? So I think the most recent revision date in there is actually 1/16/2025, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're curious, or if you're in there taking a look at things, right? If you see within the menu, there's an area that's in red, that means there was a revision of some sort that was actually added to that document. Right, so in addition to the program manual and the webinars, you can also submit a case as well as book an appointment. So on the left-hand side, there's two different tabs there. You can submit a case. You can actually, this allows you to reach out to, with a question, right? So you can get the information you're looking for. Or if you're looking to try to schedule a meeting where you're having a hard time actually create that bookings meeting, that type of thing. There's also the design consultant assistance that's available to contractors. This is fairly new. Some contractors have actually participated in this. But if you have a project where you're just really trying to, you're struggling coming up with a system design for this particular home, you can submit a case and request air source heat pump design consultant assistance. You can submit that to us, and we can get you in touch with Max over at NYSERDA and help facilitate that to see if we can get you in touch with one of them.
Is it a third party that?
Yes, it is.
Okay, who's the third party?
There's.
It's a group of different.
Yeah, it's a group of different.
Some of them are individuals, some
Yeah.
are companies. It's just a
Good.
Yeah. So, but this is something that's available to contractors as well too. And then booking the appointments, you can go in there and you click the booking appointment. This brings you to various different topics here, right? So the menu of different types of meetings you may have questions on. This particular one, you can actually go in and look at technical HVAC. You can go to the calendar and pick a date, what might work for you. And then there's some associated time slots that are open. I think I've met with majority of contractors using this tool. The nice thing about this is I know the transition on our delivery from a year and a half, 2 years ago to where we are today. There's less face-to-face time. With that bookings tool, we can do screen shares, right? So it's not just an email. We can actually do a screen share. We can turn cameras on. We can actually walk through a project, right? So it does, it's not in person, but it's about as in person as we can get, in this kind of a time frame, right? To actually sit there next to you and be able to use the technology to our benefit and kind of work in those projects in real time and provide that assistance. So, Jay, I've worked with Al and stuff, and it's been a benefit, So, Mike, we've engaged on some stuff too, right? So, so some common send-back reasons, right? So, the different verification points that we've actually kind of reviewed here, the documents and the data that's in those documents, right? And where those inputs in NIHAP kind of live. These are some of the common send-back reasons that we do see, right? So, and really, sometimes in the manual J's, we'll see like an incorrect surface. It's maybe where they've actually traced the building, right? So it's got the wrong square footage. Or maybe because of the age of the home, it's associated a single pane window where that house actually has double pane windows, right? It's just been something that was maybe overlooked as we were completing that document, right? But a lot of the times, most of what we're seeing is the clerical issues from taking the information from these documents and putting into NIHAP, right? So the information might be there, but it's just not in the right spot, and it needs to be updated so that the revision's needed. So, but again, some of it's programmatic as far as like the sizing requirements. That was more, we still see some of that, but really it's, that's kind of resolved itself as the more experience we've got with these projects that we've seen come through. But again, it's the existing equipment tags, the manual S's, right, the manual D's, some of those nuances with that, some of them not even being included. Some of the other things too is like when we're submitting these documents, when we're actually uploading them, if there's a revised document, use the comment and actually put revised on such and such a date in that comment area, because you know as well as that your view into NIHAP is the same as ours, right? So that documents page, the more documents you get, it gets really, they all look the same after a while, right? So really we can sort by date, but having a comment in there sometimes is an outlier that helps with that. So if you're uploading a PDF or something like that, that comment sometimes goes a long way. Because the file name, The file name doesn't always match what that is either, right? So the file naming conventions, right? All that type of thing comes into play in this. And again, you know, not to kind of beat a dead horse, but those additional notes, right? Making sure that if you do have any outliers or if there's something you want to call attention, just make sure those notes are there as well too. That really helps. So that project document verification, right? So all the documents that were submitted, these are kind of like the different, this is just another way of kind of like parse that information down, right? So you've got the manual D. We want to make sure that it aligns with the need for the manual D, right? So we're looking at the manual J itself, the BTUs, right? We're looking at the system configuration. We're looking at the equipment in the manual S. And then basically, based on that equipment selection and the total CFM, we want to see that manual D can move those BTUs throughout the house where they're intended to go as well, too. For instance.
Is there any free software for manual D or simple software?
Not that I'm familiar with, in all honesty. It's
The manual D is, the ACA forms are free.
yeah, the ACA, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you can download it from ACA and then, you know, work with them a little bit to make it easy for yourself.
Are they fillable or just print? Yeah.
All right, so then once you've, so we just got the project approved, right? So it's been an hour and 15 minutes, the project's approved, and now you guys can go and, how about that, time warp? Right? So, but now we're going through with the installation of the project, right? So these are some like best practices, some things to be mindful of, right? When the project's being completed. And some of the nuances associated to not necessarily just a project, but also when there's a heat pump included with the work scope. So you've got the contract, right? So you want to make sure that there's a contract in place that's been signed, right? That test out form is the pre-installation customer affirmation, right? That's in place. So if there's any installation of air sealing as part of the work scope, verify that that can be complete. If you send a crew out there, right? The auditor went out there and he's looking, I mean, again, I'm not pointing fingers, but the auditor goes out there and he says, you know what? There's 6,000 square foot of wall. That's a lot of money, and I can make 4% on that, right? They probe one spot and they say, yeah, there's no insulation. Well, maybe that was one spot. The rest of the house has been modified, right? So now there's 3,200 square foot of insulation that can't be installed. That's going to tank the savings on that project, right? Tanking the savings on that project may affect that project. You know what I mean? It's still insulated. It still may meet the program requirements, but now the savings aren't going to be there either, right? So there's cause and effect here, right? So it's making sure that when we're out there doing the assessment, we're as accurate as we can. No, it's not always perfect, right? But making sure that the work is actually going to be able to be achieved. And that also goes with the air sealing, right? So if we're at 16 ACH and we're trying to get it down to that 7 and we're at 10, right? Now we may have a sizing issue with that equipment. It's not necessarily just getting paid, but it's also the impacts, the operation of that system and customer comfort, okay? So there's really some things we really need to look at. And again, you're outside of those program requirements at that point too, right? So now we're starting to now we're really starting, this project's gonna get scrutinized a little bit more, right? What happened? And if there's trends, then, we all know where that goes. So it's just making sure that it's, we're trying to do our due diligence on the front end so that the work itself can actually be done. Right, so want to make sure that heat pump equipment is actually installed to manufacturer's specifications, that customer has been educated to the proper operation of this. We all know that that's 50% of the piece of the project, right? Is the customer education on this and understanding how this equipment works. They've been provided the warranty information, right? So that equipment's actually been registered, so that the warranty is actually in place. There's the commissioning report and the decommissioning reports that were required by our program. So if the appliance manufacturer does not have a commissioning report, you can use the one that program has through Clean Heat, right? But those are required. There's the NIHAP inputs that are also needed. There's the warranty. I talked about the warranties. Verification and all the obligations have been met, right? So within that contract that you sign with that customer, has everything been satisfied, right? That's something to be mindful of. We haven't really had to engage with that too much unless you're working in HP 5 years ago, but that's something that's kind of come back around now, right? So we need to make sure that there's anything that's in that contract that's been agreed to, that we're fulfilling that with the customer. Photos of any installed measures, right? maybe they're part of the approval note that was sent back is please provide picture of X, Y, and Z at final project submission. So that should be articulated to the crew so that if they're opening up the space to take that picture, to close it back up, you know, we want to make sure that we have that document so that when QC goes or QA goes out there, there's that picture so you're not getting a 1, right? So it's making sure that we're fully transparent and aware of what the requirements are. And then those final signatures are obtained on the test out forms and that kind of thing. Right, a couple of examples here, the commissioning and decommissioning form, right? The decommissioning themselves, depending on the existing system that's there that you're actually replacing, is going to inform on what checklist you use here, right? So there's I think 6 or 7 different types of choices you have here, making sure that that's in alignment with the system you're pulling out. And then if you don't have a commissioning report or a form from the manufacturer, which some of the manufacturers we know early on we saw that there was difficult getting those, or something that actually provide value, you know, in addition to that. So we can actually take a look at the commissioning form here that's included in. And these links are also in the forms section on the contractor support as well too.
Do you want us to use their decommissioning sheet also?
Yeah, so you need to use one of these here, Mike, depending on what you've got for your existing system. You need to kind of identify which one makes the most sense, and then use that checklist associated to it. Right, so here's kind of, again, just a kind of a breakdown of the required forms, right? So for your standard project, right, you got your test out form, your contracts, your photos, you know, all geotagged. You got your invoice, you got your subcontractor invoice if there's any there, right? The appliance exchange agreement, and then for heat pumps, you've got these additional ones, right? You've got your commissioning form, you've got the photos, you've got your subcontractor equipment invoice, the decommissioning checklist, you've got your heat pump acknowledgement form, and then for existing ducted systems, we were tying in, and you didn't have to supply that manual D, doing that static pressure test and making sure that, and it's in alignment with the manufacturer's specification. That's really what we're looking at, right? We want to make sure that it's meeting that minimum requirement to make sure that that equipment's operating to meet those manufacturers, within those manufacturer tolerances. Right, and then basically some of those final project inputs in NIHEP, you can see here the different fields, right? So you've got your commissioning and decommissioning, you've got your post blower door number in here, and then down at the bottom here too, right, you see, there we go, right there, you're including your serial numbers, right?
It's
So
getting bounced back.
What's that?
That one's getting bounced back. 7.1.
Yep. No, your post is fine too. The 7.1 was approved.
All right.
So, and everything we've kind of discussed, right, on what's required on the submission, what's required on the final project submission, in all honesty, we're doing the same thing. We're just doing a verification of those same things to make sure that information's there, right? So you can see here as far as the required documents, you know, we're looking to, like on the commission checklist, for instance, right? We're confirming that the manufacturer's specifications were met as part of the install. So on that clean heat one, like there's for an example of this, there's a section in there that talks about line set, right? So in there, you know, if you're writing it in, it's basically based on manufacturer specifications, the minimum, maximum line set as far as the diameters, vertical rises, that type of thing, and then what you have installed in place and does it meet, right? It's a checkbox. So it's really just looking for that verification. And really, we're checking that to make sure that you guys did your verification in the field, that the equipment's actually installed to meet the manufacturer's recommendations. The photos we're kind of looking at as well too, making sure we've got pictures of the equipment, making sure the inputs match up in NIHEP. That decommissioning checklist is filled out, right? It conforms with what was identified in the original pictures. The heat pump acknowledgement form has been signed off on. The contract is in place, right? The incentives are kind of, you know, the contract's there, it's been signed off on, it's you know, kind of checks all the boxes. Some of those send back reasons that we do see is, you know, based on this slide here, if not all these are met, or if there's definitely things that are missing, it's going to constitute a revision and a send back, right? So from there, we're looking, you know, if the inputs don't match, And again, like model and serial numbers sometimes, I've seen where those don't align, somebody's copying from a different file and they put the wrong equipment in, right? It happens, right? But it's a clerical issue. It's not egregious, right? There's real no malintent behind it, but it still requires an update. Changes to a work scope that were not recorded on test out, right? So on that test out form, if there was a change in square footages or something that was maybe deleted, it may be reflected in your submission, but if it's not recorded on that form, that needs to be recorded there, so that may cause a send back, which we've seen that a lot. And then some of this missing documentation as well too. Making sure we understand like the correct commissioning form, right? There's a checklist that's in there. There's a heat pump selection checklist that sometimes people are submitting as a commissioning form. There are two different documents, right? So making sure that you're using the correct one. And then the heat pump form. The final piece of the puzzle, which everyone's concerned about, which rightfully so, right? So now you've spent all this time and money and energy developing this project. You've had crews go out there, installing the expensive equipment that you put in there. Now you need to recoup those funds, right? And hopefully there's a little bit of green when you're done. So based on that, this is kind of like an expectation for the timelines, right? So once that project's been submitted for payment, if there's any type of anomaly that's identified, that it's not accurate or it's missing, that type of thing, it may be a revision, or it may have to go to technical review for some additional support. That sometimes protracts the time frame. So if it is sent back at final project review, it requires another review again, which everyone's familiar with. Once that project's been goes through final review and it can be approved for payment, that project goes into funding allocation, right? And at that point, you can kind of see here, once it goes into funding allocations, it's anywhere, usually it's a 14-day turnaround. We have seen sometimes a little bit sooner than that, but that 14-day time period is really what we should be expecting, right? We should be basing our cash flow or our projections or anything like that roughly around that 14-day. So this last slide here, I wanted to include. There's a lot of these are all links, but there's a lot of different information here as far as that can support you guys that are out in the field. Whether you're the business owner or if it's your auditors that are out there, right? Or people are just looking to learn more information about the heat pumps. So there's a lot of information here that can actually help with that. There's a couple links on here. Let's see, the marketing tools and material. That link there. There's a lot of good customer literature. It's really it's developed for that customer-facing interaction. So that can be leveraged for sure. And then down at the bottom, I wanted to kind of touch base on this one. And I actually went over this with a contractor last week and made them aware of it. But so in our program, we require the NEEP forms to be provided, right? So for air source heat pumps, we need to see the NEEP forms. Ground source is the AHRI. We sometimes see the AHRIs provided without the NEEPs, right? So air source specifically looks for those NEEP sheets. But when you're going into the NEEP site to actually pull those down, you can also use that as your sizing tool as well too, right? So that one lift kind of checks two boxes, right? So if you're doing the NEEP sizing tool, that's providing the NEEP sheet along with providing the manual S to us, okay? Now, not everyone is as versed in using that tool. So this last link on here is basically, it's an hour presentation. It's a tutorial on how to use that tool. And I actually looked at this one last fall in August, I think it was. But it's an hour of your life, but it really kind of shows you how to use that tool to its fullest capacity. And it actually goes into like when you're selecting your equipment, when it pulls it down, it shows your total load. It shows where, at certain temperatures where you're going to see the cycling issues on the heating side or on the cooling side, right? It kind of really drills down into how to use that tool to properly select the equipment to meet that load requirement, right? So if you're not familiar with using the tool, or if you've got questions on how to use that tool, this is a really helpful guide for contractors. It's an hour, right? So it might even be, maybe if you have an office day with guys, it may be an hour you can actually use on a toolbox talk or something as well too. But it's pretty helpful. I know I'm a little over. So is my cholesterol. But we're still here. So, so on that, is there questions?
Two questions.
Yeah.
But is there any consideration for customers that have solar when it comes to like additional energy savings?
So there's not. So like, so if you look at us, unfortunately, right? So we look at energy consumption. And the savings are based on the state averages, right? So when we look, people that have solar to lower their overall, utility bills, right? The problem is sometimes with that net metering, when it goes back in, it shows like negative usages, right? So
It helps, the numbers anyway.
what's that?
Okay.
No, so it actually hurts because it's not showing any, that house, that 2,000 square foot house maybe used negative 400 kilowatts last year. Well, we know that that's not the case, right? That house consumed energy, it just didn't cost them anything other than their monthly payment on their solar panels for 20 years, right? So what we have to, so on that, what I recommend to contractors is to take an estimate, look at that bill, kind of like where that usages may be, right? It's really hard to do, but like if you can't, if there's really no good marker to kind of estimate what that monthly usage would be someplace, use a similar example that you may be, if it's a 1,200 square foot ranch and, a house I was in very similar to this with 2 people, whatever, right? Same type of appliances, they use 12,000 kilowatts, they use 8,000 kilowatts. Put that on your energy usage waiver along with that and sign off on that and use that number in your utility marker and just put a note, the customer has solar, right? And it's not very, so it's actually going back into the grid. There's really no way to really actually quantify that. And there's really no good way to show that, right? You have the utility bill that shows a negative number, but you can estimate usages based off of that, so.
And I got one more.
Yeah.
I actually asked Pete this earlier. It's more of like a sales question. The difficulty that we're having, like we do a lot through clean heat.
Yep.
And it's kind of easy because we know what their rebate's gonna be.
Sure.
But how are contractors selling this? Because a lot of times the Empower Plus is not gonna fully cover the project for heat pumps, right? So ultimately customers, like we would ask for some kind of deposit in order to do all of this legwork.
Yep.
But if we don't know what the rebate's gonna be, how are we know it's gonna be at least 8,000, but it could be more than that, right? How are contractors actually selling the project with the unknown of not knowing what the rebate's gonna be?
So that is, you don't, right? So you have to build that project in NIHEP with understanding, like, depending on what kind of measures you're looking at, because there's a lot of variables you have to account for, right?
Installation.
Yeah, exactly.
But
So,
ultimately, we don't wanna do that work for no reason.
right,
Because the customer might just say like, no, I'm not paying 15,000 out of pocket.
right.
So, I mean.
No, but you don't have to though.
I was just gonna say, like, what does everyone else do
Well,
with this situation?
program caps. I mean, if the house is fully insulated and ready to go, then it's 10. If they're tier 1, they get $10,000 plus 8 from IRA, right? So 18 grand. If they're tier 3, it's 5 and 8, right?
Yep.
So
And
we
then-
should just do the math of like
Yeah,
insulation minus.
say it's 30 grand. There's no insulation. It's a clean project. It's 30 grand minus the 18,
The
right?
problem though is when my auditor is there, they don't know what the insulation is gonna cost until they put it in the system.
Sure. So if it
we
needs
wanna-
insulation, it's more difficult, but it just adds to that cost, right? So
Yeah.
if with insulation it's 40, and now you gotta take the 18 off for tier 1 or 13 off for tier 3, and then you say, hey, it's gonna be X, before you even do manual J's and all that, it's gonna be 12 grand out of pocket.
You just won't know that until you put it in the system.
Exactly.
Well,
So it's just like
exactly.
furnishing a quote for them, right? So then and then say, hey, are you in or are you out?
Cause like I'm trying to collect the
And then you have to
deposit
build it.
at the audit.
Sure, yeah.
But not, if they need insulation, which most of our customers do.
Yeah.
We have no idea what the system's gonna spit out as far as an insulation number, so it's hard to
It's
gauge
hard.
what the heat
It's
pump
hard.
number will be.
Auditor should know.
Yeah, they could
I
ballpark
mean,
it.
ballpark it.
Ballpark
Yeah.
it and even if you take a smaller deposit, just to, say it's refundable or whatever,
Right.
get them interested and on the hook, but you'll know if you're gonna have out of pocket that's significant. Cause if there's a lot of insulation work, it's gonna eat up.
Yeah, it's gonna chew
the
up
cap,
that,
right?
yeah.
So,
There's your 10, right there.
and then,
So you're assuming the 18 subtracting insulation work.
Yeah.
in your head and then giving a ballpark price to the
Exactly.
customer.
Cause if it's gonna be $5 grand or 15 grand, right, out of pocket, as long as you're in the ballpark, right, then
Right.
usually you can get them to commit. And then obviously, they can cancel if they don't like it, but
So
that's how we kinda do it, is just say, look, we know they're gonna be out of pocket, it's gonna be eight-ish grand.
Right.
Is that a stopping factor, or you still do it, what I mean? It's tough though, you're
And
right.
then you gotta adjust the invoice to reflect the
Correct.
actual heat pump rebate.
Right, which is
Right.
why we can't even get a signed contract until it's approved, because
Right.
we don't know which is why they don't require contracts till the end.
Right.
That's my biggest challenge.
It's a challenge, yeah,
And
for
with,
sure.
with clean heat, we know it's, 10 or whatever
Yeah.
it is, this is the
We're
only
going to
one.
run,
I'm
right.
not complaining about more money, but it
Right.
just, it makes it a little bit
That's the
harder to
trade-off.
sell.
You get more funding, but
Yeah.
yeah, you get less of a
You know,
definitive answer.
The other thing too is I think the more experience that, like with your auditors, depending on that, there's so many different variables, right? Because the housing stock that you're working in is completely different than the housing stock that Seth's into,
Right.
versus, the one that Jamie brought up earlier. Like Jamie's working in the Erie Canal corridor, right? He's working in a lot of old farmhouses, and he's got a struggle completely different from what you're seeing. You know what I mean? So like, the different regions have their own different struggles, but like, the more data you collect, you may be able to look at, I'm looking at it's like, you may be able to come up with a certain calculator that for yourself, so it'll kind of give you a rough and dumb what you're kind of looking at, right? So it's not going to be exact. You're still going to have to model it to identify it, but there's probably some internal documents you could create and to come up with like a 25, 50, 75 kind of marker or something like that. Depending on what your incentives are going to be, but. Because the other thing too, sorry, Mike, I'll give you in a second.
Okay.
Yep. So the other thing too is like on your insulation in NIHAP, right? You can always you can change the price. You can always go down on your pricing too, right? So depending depending on the overall square footage of insulation that you're adding or something like that, we see it a lot for spray foam, for instance. Okay, but you can do it on cellulose or other things too. Like if you're doing an open blow in a big attic, right? If you know you can blow that attic for 3,000 and the program's giving you 5, right? You can reduce that number. You can manually reduce that number in there, knowing if you're still hitting your bottom line, right, to cover that cost, in order to leverage those incentives that can go back to another measure too.
Is that
Right?
tier 1 as well?
What's that?
Is that a tier 1 as well?
You can do that. You can reduce those costs and those measures. You can't increase them. That's the only thing, right?
It makes
So-
sense.
Yeah. But you can do that, right? You have the discretion. If you know what your profit lines are,
Sure.
what your markers are, you can use it. You can make those changes. You can reduce costs on some things in order to get that project to go. I mean, we see it with spray foam all the time.
Yeah.
So, but not saying you want to, right? And
But you get a project.
But
it
you
might
know,
be
but
worth it,
you know,
right?
sometimes if you knock $1,500 off of this one to throw it over here or to make that project go, like it's, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, you guys have asked us to, work with other funding institutions,
Yep.
which is great. The thing that I'm running into, and I just been texting and emailing a customer back and forth, so her house doesn't qualify for air source heat pump because of insulation levels and air leakage.
Yep.
Fairly simple house, it's basically a mobile home on a basement.
Yep.
Now, I just got an email from HEAP that they're willing to look at it. The problem is you and NYSERDA, or whoever,
Yep.
Clear Results, whoever, and HEAP don't wanna work, or Peace don't wanna work together, because Peace says, well, Mike, we'll work with you, but you gotta make sure the project's approved before we waste our time and money to go in and estimate the project and tell the customer that we'll do it. You guys say, we can't give you an okay until we get an approval from HEAP that they'll do the work, or Peace that will do the work. So it's like, you're asking us to do something, but you as a huge entity versus us as little contractors, and don't even bring in the energy hubs because they haven't made that relationship yet. It's a stalemate.
So I think it's specific to probably that one.
No.
how was it gonna finish the question?
So, with that Pacific, Peace Group, it isn't.
No, but it's different funding sources, right, through Peace?
No, it's just one piece.
That's where I was going.
Yeah,
So-
piece is weatherization.
Yeah, so, well, that's what I'm saying though, but that's one funding entity, right?
There's
So.
no other funding entity that can cover all the installation work.
Well, but but, so like you were talking about HEAP, right?
Yeah.
And then you were talking about.
I'm sorry, I meant to
Yeah.
talk about.
No, I know, so like, but depending on the programs that you're looking to braid with,
Yeah,
there's requirements on those projects, right? So sometimes we can pull those together and sometimes we can't, it's just the nuances. Thanks, Jay. Yep, thank you. So depending on the nuances of those projects, right, there's complications and sometimes we can't always pull that together. That's a bigger conversation than you and I,
Yeah.
right? But it's a conversation I think that's worth having, that's at the state level, to help with some of these projects going through, and we can definitely bring that back to NYSERDA to make them aware of like some of these difficult, and they are, right? I mean,
because the piece most of your piece programs will be more than likely.
Well, see,
They just don't wanna spend that
right.
funding on something that may never get approved.
Right. Well, the problem is like with weatherization, right? They need to have an operating heating system in order, it's a health and safety concern. It's no different than our program, right? So there has to be a safe operating heating system in that home first before any other work can actually proceed
We
forward.
got around that already.
Yeah, no, but right, but what I'm saying though is that, so weatherization, if there's no operating heating system, they're willing to contribute funds to treat the shell,
Yeah,
right? But they need to have that heating system done before they'll actually commit funds to it.
right,
We have the exact same problem.
with insulation and everything.
We have to have an operating heating system before any other funds, you know what I mean? So like, yeah, we can agree to it, but right now, we have two exact same rules doing this because.
Well, I thought that the heating system didn't have to be operational.
Right. But we have to put it in, but the project is too large, so like, that's what I'm saying. So like, if we're looking at this, like if we're looking to braid dollars with weatherization, you guys wanna come in? No? So, when we're looking to braid dollars, now I'm on spotlight here. So when we're looking to braid dollars from other programs, right?
Yeah.
They've got rules they have to follow, we've got rules we have to follow. So sometimes it's harder to have to bring these to life, right? But at the end of the day, I was just talking about bringing weatherization and their rules regarding no heat situations and having operable heating systems, and then our rules associated to it, right? And trying to leverage dollars to bring the shell up so we can get the heat pump in and getting these two programs. Now, it's a liability issue on weatherization side. They're not gonna get paid for that project, right? They can't submit that project to the state to get paid from HCR, which goes back to DOE, right? So there's a chain of command here, right? So there's rules that they have to follow.
Sure.
That's what we're running into, right?
Okay.
So it's no different than like fuel switches, right?
Mhm.
So we can't actually, like, it used to be with weatherization, they couldn't do a fuel switch, change from oil to propane or whatever the case is. You know, so there's rules and that was a while ago, but there's rules and guidelines that our programs have to follow. The thing it is like, once we know those rules and those guidelines, Mike, we can use, like, those are the rules and the guidelines. We have to use those to our advantage to overcome those, right?
Right.
So, like, right now, the one that you're talking about, working with weatherization with Peace, like, there needs to be, you know, they say, no, we can't do this except for this. If those one-off exceptions, those are things you can actually bring to the program, and we can actually have conversations to see if there's a way that we can kind of navigate this to try to get this project to go through, right? But those are the exception. The norm is to try to really have braid those dollars together to show those leverage savings right where we can, and then trying to put these projects together. So it's not easy, you know what I mean? Like, and this is